you can't just stop business and just say, oh, that supplier is not going to work. You have to develop mitigations if that supplier doesn't have those needs, because the responsibility is ultimately of the supplier who's distributing that product.
SC Media and our sponsor, Viso Trust, are proud to present this month's CISO Stories program. Each month, the CISO Stories program explores a cybersecurity topic selected by the CyberRisk Alliance's CISO community and provides content that examines that topic from a variety of perspectives. Hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, best-selling author of CISO Compass, the CISO Stories weekly podcast features content powered by the 1,100-plus members of CyberRisk Alliance's CISO community. Listen to previous CISO Stories podcast episodes at CISOstoriespodcast.com. Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CSC. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Cassie Crossley, VP Supply Chain Security at Schneider Electric. Welcome, Cassie.
Hi, thank you, Todd. I'm glad to be here.
I am always curious about, what attracted people to cybersecurity. What was the draw for you into this field?
Well, ironically, I was involved in it and I didn't even realize that was the name of it, because back in the mid-90s, I worked at McAfee. Way back when, in the original virus scan days, led the communications and the different areas. So I worked for the VP of marketing, who worked for John, and worked with all the developers on the team. So I realized the threat landscape even back then, working both from a software, and we also had a hardware chip that we were creating called ROM Shield. And so in different parts of my career, I'm a software developer by trade, but had moved into project management and communications in different areas. So let's see, about 13 and a half years ago, I joined Schneider Electric, and I was a PMO portfolio director for the video line of business. So we were in security then, but it was more physical security because we had cameras and such. We've since divested that business, but I was involved with all the physical security aspects of it then. And I recall the first week I was there, I'm like, who's your security architect? Because I had worked at companies that had been under regulation and regulated businesses, and we had security teams that I would work with. And so it was a concept that wasn't new to me, but it was one I think that was just starting to develop back then. And I had been in some different roles, and about 8 years ago, the CISO team asked me to come in and lead the Crown Jewels program and all the governance and policy. So I worked on the CISO side, and then about 4 years ago, moved over to the product security side, since that was a lot of my background. And we merged the groups together, and I'm focusing on really my passion, which is supply chain security. And I've got a book coming out in February on software supply chain security with O'Reilly Media.
Very nice, very nice. I applaud you as a fellow author and the creator of CISO Compass, and we just released a new book, the Privacy Leader Compass. I know what that's like to get to that point where it's actually getting published, because a lot of people don't see the work that actually goes into something like that.
Yes, it's definitely a labor of love. And I did it because I was working all the time with suppliers, and I was teaching them and working on their security posture. At Schneider Electric, we have 52,000 suppliers on our ecosystem. Not all of them provide digital elements, but many of them do. And working with those suppliers to teach them what secure development lifecycle is, and not just think of it from an IT security standpoint. So I would have conversations with CISOs and other development leaders, and really go through those basics. And so it was a lot of supplier management.
So it sounds like your background in software security and then working for, a firm where that was their core business on security really puts you at a great inflection point to be able to put security controls, into the environment. So can you elaborate a little bit on, what sort of, things have you done at Schneider Electric to make sure that your supply chain is secure?
Yeah, that's a uh, interesting question because supply chain historically for most people, you worry about truly the supply. Can you get the materials? Can you, is the company financially stable? Do they have quality for that product? But when you look at the software supply chain, which is much more difficult because, you're not even if you're working with a company, they're using open source, they're using other libraries. They've had developers that have written stuff maybe for decades. So the interesting point when you're working with these suppliers is they can't go back and start from ground zero. So working with software supply chain and specifically product security, because items that get put in products all the time need to have an assessment, and the general IT assessments don't have the details needed. So I implemented what I call a product security assessment process. So any suppliers that have components that we're including in, or if they have the ability to have access to modify components, such as software or firmware through the manufacturing cycle, or distribution, as in a cloud environment or anything of that nature. We go through much more detailed assessment, check access control, ask for evidences of their secure development. If they don't have that, are there scanning tools, not just scanning of the environments, which of course is absolutely necessary, but also for scanning of the actual software libraries that they may use? Do they use penetration testing methods? Do they have an external penetration test performed? Because you can't just stop business and just say, oh, that supplier is not going to work. You have to develop mitigations if that supplier doesn't have those needs, because the responsibility is ultimately of the supplier who's distributing that product. And that's why just overall, you really need to have a broad understanding of security. I mean, understanding every aspect of it, from physical to infrastructure to IT, to deployment methodologies, and the people that are working on it. It all plays into an aspect. If you look at your phone, there were hundreds, I would say thousands of opportunities for that one device to be compromised before you even opened the box.
As a security leader, safeguarding proprietary data isn't enough. You need a holistic strategy that extends to third parties and beyond. Between doing more with less, external pressures, and achieving digital transformation, effective third-party security feels unattainable. There's a better way. VisoTrust delivers fast and accurate third-party intelligence needed to make informed CyberRisk decisions. With customers like Bain Capital, Bloomberg, and GM, VisoTrust automates third-party risk in minutes, providing deep insights for faster and efficient cybersecurity. With VisoTrust, you can automate cyber risk assessments with AI, identify and prioritize high-risk vulnerabilities, and continuously assess and monitor third parties. See how our AI-powered platform can improve your cybersecurity posture at CISOstoriespodcast.com/VisoTrust. Wow. I mean, how do you tier these different vendors to figure out how deep you need to go into the assessment?
Yeah, tiering isn't as straightforward. You can't just assume it's based off of a cost, because usually for physical suppliers, you say, we have this much spend with them, or there's, sole source supplier, we can't get this material from anything else. When it comes to suppliers that are providing you like materials or something for a product, we have to not only look at it from a spend standpoint, because that's a logical point, but also you need to understand where used. So if I am working with a operating system vendors, because if you're working with devices, especially we have operational technology and industrial IoT devices, those have a real-time operating system. And those real-time operating system vendors, if it's not an embedded Linux, but if it's a commercial vendor, they may be used in 40 products. The annual spend to maintain those services may not be that much, so they might be missed. So you really need to understand your portfolio to see if this supplier, if something happened to them, not only, is there a disruption, and especially with product security and just the aspect, if there's a vulnerability, it's the same kind of business resilience conversation CISOs should have every day. If this goes down, what is the impact? If they have a critical vulnerability, what is my impact? Can I recover? Are there mitigations that I can take? So we have this all as deciding for criteria. So I would say every few months, a new or a supplier comes to my attention, and then I also add them to the critical supplier list, because we might have been working with them for one or two products, and that worked out well. So we expand that footprint of how we're using them, and then they become a critical supplier. And we implement a process that I know a lot of companies have started to do, is we have what are called the C-level connects. Is once I've identified that as a critical supplier, I personally or other people in the organization are having at least annual, sometimes quarterly if there's a security posture path, meetings directly with those teams, not just during the agreement cycle where you're trying to work through the terms and conditions or the assessment, but actually after the fact. So my teams will pull to see if there's any changes to their security scoring systems, or if there were things and action items that we had open, but also any kind of vulnerabilities. And giving that familiar and relationship allows us in a time of crisis to be able to call that person, and we already have that relationship established.
I mean, with 52,000 suppliers, and I think you said, 11 or 15,000 would be classified as intelligent products. How do you can't look at everybody. So is there like a percentage that you would say, these are your high ones and low ones, and, what does that look like?
Yeah, I would say critical suppliers, it's definitely less than a few hundred, and less than 100 that are, truly critical that we do those C-level connects. And also think of it as some of those suppliers are also our customers and strategic accounts. And then some of them are also our suppliers from the IT side. So for example, I am not doing C-level connects with Microsoft. That's one of our regional CISOs who manages that piece. So some of that gets spread out that way, because there is, a reciprocal, just by default, because of some of the size of the suppliers. There's already that. From this assessment process, we're looking at new suppliers, and specifically any suppliers that are planned to be large. We have teams that scale these, and we have a large organization where we distribute. We have security advisors and digital risk leaders. People might call them business CISOs, that are also interacting with the suppliers in different forms or fashions. So we do. It's a large scale, but we also have a large set of leadership that have identified and set up these connections and these assessments and reviews. And we, from a services standpoint, or, from a service standpoint, the monitoring of a lot of this is automated. We have, multiple services that check the external footprint, that can identify, if there's any breaches or data exposures or any risks that need to be highlighted, so that we can bring them to our attention quickly.
Okay, so you've got some proactive mechanism in place, and so that you can look at this on an exception basis, or are you
Yes.
just getting all the reports back, or do
Yes.
they funnel that down for you?
Yes. So, for example, if one of the critical suppliers that I have on the list assigned to me, if something happens, I'll be immediately contacted through the both our threat intel or potential crisis channel, and we do actual simulations and crisis management where we've had suppliers participate in that as part of that program to make sure that especially those critical suppliers have been able to test with us some of this process.
I had bought a new car during the pandemic, during the height of I know we still have COVID going around, but during the height of the pandemic, and it was a 6 month delay, which I was fine with because I really it was it was fine. My car was fine, and so I had to wait 6 months for it. But then recently, I had some problems with the driver restraint system, and so they needed a module. Well, they had to send to Germany to get the module, and then they put that in, and then the same problem happened after a couple hundred miles of driving the car, and so then they replaced the wiring harness in the car. And this is a fairly new car, and I had learned during the pandemic that most of the wiring harnesses were made in the Ukraine. And and so I started thinking about this. I thought, well, you know, I that just causes those kind of delays. So have you in this global environment where we have these different conflicts going on around the world, how has that impacted your supply chain software security strategy?
Yeah, and it's partially hardware and firmware strategy too. It is definitely something that we discuss every day. With any of these supply chain points, you not only do you have things like COVID, but you have geopolitical items, as you mentioned, like Ukraine, and then you have trade activities going on, which can complicate things. So for I would say that for si- significantly critical products, both from either a footprint and basically a market standpoint, but also uh, from for some other reasons because we operate in so much in critical infrastructure. We have a regionalization program, and a lot of this was highlighted during COVID, where as I mentioned earlier, sole source or single source suppliers, you're used to that, but everybody saw it when it came to effective toilet papers and other kinds of items where you have all this sole sourcing. So with this regionalization program for certain products, we have really taken a look at how to replicate and build the entire device using different suppliers and different locations. So it's very regionalized. So the same product can essentially be built, a duplicate of it in a different area. So if something happens, that could be um, uh, they can not only be able to provide and be able to leverage economies, so that there's more a better distribution pattern. The problem is that a lot of it, just like that, like you're experiencing, because of patents and other reasons, there are sole source suppliers for certain items that is impossible to get away with. That no matter what, you have to consider about having appropriate stock in place. Before the pandemic, manufacturing had gotten very lean and had gone to just in time manufacturing, right? And that of course, failed miserably in certain areas when the pandemic hit. And all trade lines were, slowed down or stopped for certain things. And so I think that there's a better balance now where you're examining your stock and the risk, and you're not only examining it based off of what we normally would have done, like a last time buy, but you're looking more at the potential supplier risk as part of that to see how long could you survive? Have you qualified? That's something that we talk about with devices. Is this a qualified component that can replace that other component? Because when you're looking at anything, I mean, Apple just can't change out the system chip. Easily. They would have to qualify and go through many, the exact same number of tests that they had for the original one, and that takes a lot of engineering time. So it's a pretty complicated process, and sometimes not even fully achievable. You have to manage the stock appropriately to be able to solve for those kind of issues.
What sort of tools do you find really help out with the third party risk management?
Well,
Not
without naming,
necessarily brands,
yeah, I
not
won't name
brands so
those.
much, but
Yeah.
like what tools have you found have really been helpful?
Well, let's see. There's so many. There's so many great tools out there now that look at supplier management and third party risk management. If you walk around RSA, I think half of them say third party, some level of risk management. So there's a lot of overlap. We use so if I talk just about hardware components, there's many tools out there that now we're using to leverage the supply chain, which looks at where the shipping manifests even go to make sure that that item is truly that item. So you're validating it for counterfeit reasons. It's coming from the assigned location that you've been told it was being manufactured. So that traceability and chain of custody and supply chain is very important. So that's at the just hardware level, so you can follow the materials, because of course there's a lot of regulations regarding just material usage and where things are produced. And then when you're looking at the actual products themselves and where they're going through, there are different, I would say, services that are more niche. For example, a lot of the products that we're selling into the electrical industry, there are certain service providers looking at third party risks. So utility companies are using a subset of third party risk providers that understand the electrical OT and electrical application space. So a lot of ones that are working with that. And I think those are good. I mean, they would not be the right one to look for at medical products, right? You have supply chain and third party risk management companies looking at medical devices and making those decisions. And that's really what I recommend for a lot of companies, because even ourselves, if I was looking for a specific component that wasn't in our scope, leveraging service providers that can do that is important. So, I recommend to CISOs, if you're in financials, you should be looking at service providers that do, if you're in fintech, that work with fintech companies to examine the suppliers, because you have to worry about certain regulations that you're going to need to follow, and they're going to check certain areas. I have been working a lot with some U.S. government and other entities that are actually the service third party risk the identification and services companies for governments, and they are looking at different things, right, than a normal CISA would look at. So now I'm getting that exposure of what is that looking at, and I've been working for the past year with the MITRE system of trust with Bob Martin there, because that is a much more expanded footprint that we can change the portfolio to be able to identify what risks that we're going to look at. But everybody's going to look at it through a different lens. If you're purchasing, for example, if you're a CISO that's purchasing a buildings operations system because you're in charge of data centers everywhere, you're going to have a different perspective than a cloud first company that is going to be looking mainly at the software supply chain, or you might be looking only at appliance vendors like Cisco. So it really varies. I
Well,
just say don't do it all yourself. There's experts in the field, and there's tools that can help give you that knowledge.
I'm glad to hear you're working with Bob Martin, because I don't know about anybody that's more. I've known Bob a long time. That's more passionate about, making sure that the vulnerabilities are being taken care of
Mhm.
wherever they may be.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great, Cassie. I just have one final question for you, and then I'd like to get some. What's your advice for new CISOs, current CISOs, experienced CISOs, emerging CISOs as they're going down this path? But also, what do you see the future of third-party risk management? Where are we going to be going the next 5-10 years?
Okay. I'll start with the latter one. The 5 to 10 year prediction is a lot of what I'm working on is transparency. The topics of software bill of materials, I've been involved with the groups for almost 4 years now. And then also not just and going far beyond software bill of materials, especially if I'm working with critical infrastructure, they want to know specifically which areas and regions the software is built in, where the development team's located, and providing that transparency, which isn't normally found in SBOMs that has a lot of, the software components by list, and it'll list, whether or not you're using Log4j, but maybe not at the multiple levels. But software transparency and product transparency, because it's much more than just the software. For all of these, things that are giving you power right now, those pieces of equipment that are going into planes and so on and so forth. A lot of these closed industries, closed systems like cars and planes and things like that, have been very aware, but also very close to the chest on where everything comes from and how the sausage is made, and that's not sufficient going forward in regards to being able to address risk, because as a CISO you're going to have to take on that risk, and if you don't know, at least if you don't have the option to know, you may not have the resources to be able to handle all that information, but not giving that opportunity to be able to say, this is going to be a critical system. I would like to know where that data center is. I'd like to know where that data is hosted. I'd like to know, do you use third party contractors to manage my data? That's really important information, and that transparency is one of the biggest topics that I'm working on in the third party risk and supply chain area. And some of us, it's historical, so you have to start somewhere with capturing that information. You can't go back and invent history, which makes it difficult. Like, you don't know the reasons why that library was selected, but it's there, and so that's important. And that's part of it. So for emerging and new CISOs, I think one of the things that I always like to suggest is you need to think just beyond your four walls, and more than just questionnaires for assessments, especially if you're looking at supplier risk. As I mentioned earlier, really knowing your crown jewels, both your data and your critical processes, are very important. If you have your ERP go down and you really didn't understand the application side of it and how it was constructed, and that it had security gaps or external ports open for management, you're leaving attack surfaces wide open because it's not typical IT infrastructure. So I really, a lot of the CISOs, the more I guess CISOs that have been around a while, are starting to now pick up a lot of CIO and application coverage, because it's become such a significant area for threats. And with supply chain risks, software supply chain, especially things like SolarWinds, they need to have that visibility. So if they come from a background where they've been more of a network engineer and an IT security person, there's a lot of growth to do in the application security and understanding. You don't have to be a developer, but you have to realize that all of those applications are going to have a threat. And you just don't, someone's got to be responsible for looking after it, especially if they're critical.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, and it's a lot more complex than I think we give it credit for sometimes. I interviewed Tim Brown, the CISO for SolarWinds,
Yes.
about a year ago, and it was after the breach, after he's put in these other controls, and it's interesting to me how much investment
Hmm.
they've put in afterwards, and the way that they got in. So if people are interested in listening to that podcast, we have that out there as well.
Excellent.
But this has been great, Cassie. Thanks for the work that you're doing. I think we're all going to benefit from this, and we look forward to your new book coming out. So,
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in for this week's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. We want to say a special thank you to our sponsor, VisoTrust. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new story each Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We'll see you next week for a new episode.